The Montana sky stretched endlessly, pale blue and full of wind. The scent of pine and damp earth drifted across the valley, mingling with the rhythmic thud of an axe striking wood. Clara wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, her once fine gloves torn from weeks of work. Each log she stacked was a promise that she would never depend on anyone again. The land was rough, but so was she. Life had taught her that survival didn't come easy, especially for a woman alone. Her husband had died 2 winters ago, fever and snow taking him before the spring thaw. She had buried him herself, near the old oak that once shaded their tent. Since then, she had wandered from camp to camp until she found this piece of land, tucked against the mountain and kissed by the sun. Now, with blistered palms and aching arms, she was building her own cabin, 1 log at a time. Across the meadow, on the other side of a low stream, a cowboy sat quietly atop his horse. His name was Luke Tanner, a man whose life had once been full of laughter and the sound of a woman's voice calling him home. But those days were gone. His wife, Mary, had died in childbirth 3 years ago. Since then, the ranch had grown silent, and Luke had grown older in the quiet. That morning, as he rode the fence line, he saw smoke curling from Clara's clearing, and then her. A slender figure with sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair tied back, determination etched into every movement. She lifted each log with the strength of someone who had no one left to lift it for her. He couldn't help but stop and watch. Something about her stirred him. Maybe it was the way she refused to quit, even when her body clearly begged for rest. Maybe it was the way she stood against the horizon like she belonged to the land itself. He told himself it was none of his business. A woman's work was her own affair, and the West didn't take kindly to men who meddled. But as the days passed, he found reasons to ride that way more often, to check the stream, to look at the ridge, to find her silhouette against the sunset. Clara noticed him, of course. You couldn't miss a man on horseback watching from across the field. But she never waved, never called out. She simply went on working, as if proving something to the whole world. That night, Luke sat on his porch, the sky above him scattered with stars. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stared into the darkness. He had long since buried his hope for companionship, yet something about that woman's fierce will burned like an ember in his chest. Out there, beneath the endless Montana sky, 2 souls carried their sorrow quietly, unaware that fate had already set them on a path that would bring warmth to their cold hearts once more. The next morning dawned golden and cool, the air thick with the scent of dew-soaked grass. Clara was already at work before the sun crested the ridge, lifting one end of a heavy log toward the growing frame of her cabin. Her muscles screamed, but she refused to stop. The West was no place for weakness, and pity was a luxury she'd long buried. As she struggled to balance the beam, her foot slipped on the damp earth. The log rolled, striking her shin, and she let out a soft cry, the first sound she'd made all morning. Before she could try again, a deep voice came from behind her. "Need a hand, ma'am?" Clara turned sharply, startled. The voice belonged to the same man she'd seen from across the field, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a hat shadowing most of his face. He held the reins of his horse loosely, as if he'd been waiting for her to say yes. She hesitated. "I can manage," she said, brushing off her apron. "I don't doubt it," he replied, stepping closer, "but sometimes even the strong could use another pair of hands." Clara studied him for a moment, the kindness in his tone, the quiet grief behind his steady gaze. Then, finally, she sighed and nodded. Together, they lifted the beam, setting it perfectly into place. "Name's Luke Tanner," he said, offering a small smile. "Clara Hayes," she answered. They worked in silence for a while. Luke's movements were practiced, steady, the kind of strength that came from years of mending fences and carrying hay bales. When the last piece of wood was secure, Clara stepped back and looked at the progress they'd made. The cabin finally looked like more than scattered lumber, it looked like a home. "You've done all this yourself?" Luke asked, glancing around in admiration. "Every log," she said proudly. "Didn't come all the way to Montana just to depend on someone else." He nodded. "Understand that better than most." When the sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Clara lit a small fire. She offered Luke coffee, the cowboy's universal language of gratitude. They sat on overturned buckets near the flames, steam curling from their tin mugs. "You from town?" she asked softly. "Got a ranch a few miles west," he said. "Mostly cattle. Mostly quiet. Quiet's good, she murmured. He studied her face, the shadows dancing across her cheekbones. There was something fragile beneath all that strength, something that reminded him of himself. As the night deepened, neither wanted to be the first to leave. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was easy, familiar. When Luke finally rose, he tipped his hat and said, "You're doing fine work, Clara. Don't be surprised if I ride by again to check your progress." She smiled faintly. "You're welcome too." As his horse's hooves faded into the distance, Clara looked at her cabin and then at the stars. For the first time in years, the world didn't feel quite so empty. The days rolled by in a rhythm of work and quiet companionship. Luke kept his word, he rode over often, sometimes bringing nails or flour, sometimes just his quiet presence. Clara pretended not to expect him, though every morning she found herself glancing toward the ridge, waiting for that familiar figure on horseback to appear against the sky. By late autumn, the nights grew colder. The cabin was nearly finished, the roof shingled, the fireplace built, the windows sealed against the mountain wind. Still, Clara refused to slow down. One afternoon, she climbed the ladder to patch a corner of the roof before the snow came. Luke, who'd arrived to deliver firewood, called up, "That ladder doesn't look too steady." "It's fine," she said, tightening her grip. But as if the ladder heard her defiance, it shifted under her boots. A sharp crack split the air. Clara. Before she could react, the world tilted. She fell, straight into Luke's arms. The two of them stood frozen, his hands gripping her waist, her heartbeat pounding against his chest. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the wind sighing through the trees. "I told you it wasn't steady," he murmured finally, a half-smile tugging at his lips. She drew back slightly, cheeks flushed. "You think you're always right, don't you? Only when I'm not wrong." That earned him a small laugh, light, genuine, the first he'd heard from her. It was a sound that hit him like sunlight after a long winter. That evening, snow began to fall, the first of the season. Luke stayed, helping her light the fire and seal the windows. They shared stew and coffee again, sitting close to the hearth as the flames danced between them. For a long while, neither spoke. The silence was heavy, but comfortable. Then Clara looked into the fire and said softly, "I wasn't always alone. I had a husband once." Luke's hands stilled around his mug. "So did I." She nodded, eyes glistening with the firelight. "He died 2 winters ago. Fever took him before I could fetch help. Everything after that, just felt empty." Luke swallowed, his voice low. "Mary died giving birth to our son. He didn't make it either." Their eyes met, two people carved by loss, carrying the same quiet ache. Clara reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "I think, maybe we were both meant to learn how to start over." He turned his hand, fingers closing gently around hers. "Maybe," he said, voice barely a whisper. Outside, the snow thickened, soft and silent. Inside, the fire burned bright, not just in the hearth, but somewhere deeper. For the first time in years, Luke didn't feel like a man remembering what he'd lost. He felt like one discovering what he still could have. And as Clara looked into his eyes, she realized she wasn't just building a cabin, she was building the beginnings of a new life. Winter came hard to Montana that year. The snow fell thick and heavy, burying fences and turning the world white. But inside Clara's cabin, warmth filled every corner, the scent of pine logs burning, stew simmering, and laughter that hadn't echoed there before. Luke had started staying longer each day, sometimes helping mend the barn, sometimes just keeping her company by the fire. What began as neighborly visits turned into shared meals, quiet evenings, and a kind of comfort neither had known in years. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Clara stitched a quilt while Luke sat near the fire, carving a small wooden horse. The flickering light softened his face, and she found herself studying him, the lines of strength, the quiet sadness that still lingered, and the kindness that had slowly melted her defenses. "You're good with your hands," she said with a smile. He chuckled. "You should have seen me try to cook before you came along. That was a real tragedy." She laughed, shaking her head. "Maybe you needed someone to keep you from starving. Maybe I did." His eyes met hers, and the humor faded into something deeper. "Truth is, Clara, I needed more than that." The room grew still except for the crackle of the fire. He set the carving down and leaned forward. "You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again, peace." Her breath caught. "I didn't do anything special, Luke." "You did," he said softly. "You lived. You kept going." You reminded me what it means to keep building, even when everything's been torn down. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled through them. Funny. I thought I was building a cabin. Turns out, I was building a home. Luke reached across the table and took her hand. Then let's finish it together. That spring, the snow melted, revealing green pastures and wildflowers pushing through the thawing soil. The cabin stood strong, polished logs gleaming in the sunlight, smoke curling from the chimney like a quiet song of victory. Luke helped her plant a small garden, his big hands clumsy in the dirt. Clara teased him, and he laughed, the kind of deep, easy laughter that felt like it had been waiting years to return. Neighbors who passed by often saw them working side by side, sometimes silent, sometimes talking like they'd known each other forever. They started calling Clara's place the Tanner cabin, and neither she nor Luke corrected them. One golden morning, Luke stood on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to Clara, then looked at the cabin, their cabin. "You've been building more than walls here," she said gently. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And you've been healing more than hearts." Under the wide Montana sky, with the mountains standing guard and the wind carrying the scent of wildflowers, they kissed, slow, quiet, certain. The lonely cowboy and the woman who built alone had finally finished what they both started, not just a cabin, but a home, and a life worth living again.